Hello, this is Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynytsia, The Well, a podcast series about topics of interest to Ukrainians around the world. Today is Thursday, December 4th, 2025. Our guest today is Anders Aslund, a Swedish economist, former senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and a preeminent specialist on Eastern European economies. This episode is produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. Welcome, Anders. How are you?
Thank you. Very well, thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us again today. To start off with, can we just do a recap on some background on your professional career?
You're welcome. Yeah, as you mentioned, I'm a Swedish economist. I did my PhD at Oxford. I have been dealing with formerly the Soviet Union and then primarily with Russia and Ukraine for the last 50 years. And I published a large number of books, written 17 books and edited 16. I have been working, I set up an institute in Stockholm in 1989 at the Stockholm School of Economics, which is now Stockholm Institute of Transition Economics. I worked as an economic advisor to the reformist Russian government under Yegor Gaidar, 91 to 94. And then I worked as an economic advisor to President Kuchma, 94 to 97. And I have been involved in Ukrainian economic affairs in one way or the other ever since. So I've been doing a lot on the Ukrainian economy.
Anders, how well is Russia's economy holding up during the war with Ukraine?
Not very well. It might surprise you, but the Russian and Ukrainian economic situations look pretty similar, with inflation of around 10% and a growth rate of about 1%. The big difference is that Ukraine gets a lot of the financial support and Russia has no access to international financing. Not even China gives Russia any kind of financing. So the choke point for the Russian economy is, first of all, finance. They are now running out of the liquid part of their reserve fund. The second is to squeeze the export revenues, which is primarily oil, where the Ukrainian the armed forces are now doing a good job bombing Russian oil facilities and recently tankers. And the third choke point, which is not working so well, is technology sanctions, where Russia now seems to have a pretty free access to a good Chinese technology.
And what are conditions like on the ground for Russia's major companies?
We are seeing that quite a few of them are suffering quite badly. The current big news is that the Russian railways have a massive debt and is heading towards bankruptcy. I presume that it will be bailed out by the Russian state banks, but money is a scarce resource. And there's been a strange restructuring of the Russian economy. The most progressive parts in the West, they have suffered badly from the cut off of most of the trade with Europe, while the old Soviet arms factories east of Urals have come back. And that's where we have seen an increase in production in 2023 and 2024, while now that is over. And there's also an expansion in the Far East because of the greatly increased trade with China, but that is very much Russia importing from China. Russia has become the junior partner of China and is becoming ever weaker.
You mentioned sanctions before. Have Western sanctions had a significant impact on Russia's economy during the war?
Yes, the financial sanctions are most obvious, and as a result of that, I would argue that Russia's growth rate has been 2% a year less than it would have been otherwise. Russia can only run a budget deficit of 2% of GDP each year, which is nothing if you compare with the US budget deficit of 6-7% of GDP each year, because there's no money. So Russia's expenditure from the federal budget on the military is only 8%, and they are not increasing it now. And from the regional budgets, they are cutting the defense expenditure, while Ukraine is spending half its GDP on the military, because for Ukraine, this is an existential war. For Russia, it's not. It's an existential war for Putin, who lives on wars, but not for the Russian people.
Is Russia sliding into a recession at this time?
It looks like it. So the growth rate of 1% is now gradually declining. There has been reports that the last couple of months have had no growth.
And has there been a significant drop in Russia's oil and gas industry revenue this year?
Yes, there has been a substantial decline of about 1/4. And if you go back from 2022 to 2023, when the first Western oil sanctions or energy sanctions came into force, Russia's total export value fell by 28%, which is quite substantial. But of course, it could and should be more. And I think right now, the Ukrainian armed forces are imposing more effective sanctions than the West.
And is Europe still consuming Russian oil and gas?
Yes, but to a very limited extent. There are 5 countries that are importing LNG, and there are the 2 resistance countries, Hungary and Slovakia, that import oil and gas from Russia. And of course, Viktor Orban of Hungary appears a supporter of Putin, and he's the main problem when it comes to getting European sanctions on Russia.
And what impact on the Russian economy have Ukrainian drone attacks on oil refineries and infrastructure this year?
They have had a substantial short-term effect, so that 20-30% of oil capacity has been stopped temporarily. The problem is that in most of these cases, the facilities tend to come back online rather fast. So it's difficult to assess the effect on a short-term basis. We have to wait until the whole year has passed to see how much it has actually been. Probably not as much as one would have hoped, but it has meant that a substantial part of Russia has now a shortage of gas for ordinary population. And if a gas system in Russia is being hit during the deep winter, that could be quite severe, much more so than in Ukraine.
Anders, we're just about out of time, but I did have a final question for you. What is the outlook for the Russian economy in 2026?
Well, 1% growth for each year going forward, 26 and 27. That's what the Bank of Finland Research Institute, which is quite good, predicts. And what everybody's talking about now is stagflation. The interest rate is still 15.5%, while official inflation is now 7%, which I don't much believe in, because inflation expectations are persistently about 13%. And this is a big gap between measured inflation and inflation expectations. So I think that inflation expectations reflect the real inflation. And the big companies in Russia, both state-owned and privately owned, complain that the interest rate is too high, and therefore they can't invest. So something that is becoming more important now, it is a very small investment in anything but the military. And the Russian economy, its infrastructure is very vulnerable because it's all about Transsib now, a Trans-Siberian railroad, which goes to China. And that is really the lifeline of the Russian economy today. And it goes over the big Siberian bridges. The Ukrainians are fully capable of taking out some of these bridges. And then there is no alternative road of transportation apart from shipping around the whole world to China. So Russia is in many ways more vulnerable than Ukraine, which has a much better infrastructure simply because of where it's located and what grounds it covers and in what climate.
Anders, thank you so much for joining us today on Krynytsia.
Thank you, my pleasure.
I have been speaking with Anders Aslund, a Swedish economist, former senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and a preeminent specialist on East European economies. This episode of Krynytsia is produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. Until next time, that's all for now.